topic, of course, for this year is the teaching of Pope Francis. And tonight it's my job to try and give you some kind of information about how he came to be the person he is, his life story. It's far too complicated for me to deal with adequately, really, but I'll try and deal with what it seems to me are the main things about him. When Pope Francis was elected, I had vaguely heard of him. I remember this Archbishop of Buenos Aires at the previous, had been talked about at the previous election, but obviously I've never met him, and fundamentally, when he was elected Pope, I knew exactly the same as most of you know, which is nothing, you know. And as happens at so many of these talks, I have nothing to say that you couldn't find out for yourselves. Because all I have done is read and tried to gather the essence of the story from what I've read, and you could all do the same. I mean, fundamentally, the first thing I read was that this book, which many of you have read, which came out shortly after he was elected, Untying the Knots by Paul Vallely. More recently, I read, especially when I was in Spain last week, The Great Reformer by Austin Ivory, and those two are the main sources of my information. I read this little book as well, and one of the first things I discovered was a major error in fact in it. But then that could be true of all these that I just didn't notice. Well, that's particularly noticeable because I read a lot of stuff on the internet about Argentinian politics at the time and so on. And one of the things you notice again is how careful you have to be about what you read, you know, because you can't believe everything that you read. And I've used very little of this was a book by Pope Francis himself. So those were my sources. So if you want to get the same sources and read them for yourself, then you don't need to listen to what I have to say. The obvious place to start is at the beginning. But I don't want to say too much about it. The starting date for us, as you see, is 1927. Jorge Bergoglio wasn't born until 1936, but in 1927 his grandparents, you see there, Giovanni Angelo Bergoglio and Rosa Vassallo di Bergoglio, along with their 6 children, arrived in Argentina from Italy on a boat called the Giulio Cesare. Not as they had originally planned on the Principessa Mafalda. Now that's very significant because they had originally booked, as some of you may know, on the Principessa Mafalda, but they had to change their booking because the money they were waiting from the sale of their confiteria, their kind of coffee and cake shop near Turin, was delayed, and so they couldn't go on the Principessa Mafalda, which turned out to be fortunate for them because it sank and everybody on it was drowned. It was the Argentinian Titanic. So that became part of the myth of the family. Of course, life's full of that kind of stuff. I've told some of you about a book I read last summer during the holidays in Spain. It was the stories of 4 different women during the Spanish Civil War. 2 of them were quite poor, 2 of them were very upper class. And in the course of one of their lives, it was one of the very upper class women, a fellow she was having an affair with was in Berlin, and while driving his car through the streets of Berlin, he knocked down a pedestrian. This would be during the Civil War. Actually, I wonder if it was during the Civil War or if it was before it. Probably, yeah. Anyway, it turned out that the person wasn't too injured, but the person she knocked down was Adolf Hitler. You know, or he knocked down was Adolf Hitler. And it just shows you the things that change history. I mean, everything we do every day is shaping our lives. I often shake my head when a football commentator says, you know, if that goal had just gone in, it would have been 2 weeks. Well, That is not true unless it was the last kick of the game. If it was the last kick of the game, you could say that. But if it happens anywhere in the course of the game, every pass that's made changes the shape of the game. You know, and it's true. Everything we do every day is shaping our lives. The choices that we make. But you know, that's one that makes you wonder. You know, what would have happened? So God knows, because I mean, the possibilities are literally infinite. We could live in an infinite number of worlds. We just happen to live in the world that we live in. When the family arrived in Argentina, and there were lots and lots of other people doing the same thing, Italy in particular sent so many people to Argentina. And they say that today 60% of Argentinians claim Italian origin. And all you have to do is look at the Argentinian football team and you'll discover it's chock-a-block with people with Italian names all over the place. In fact, in Bergoglio's story, a lot of the names of bishops that pop up in his story are Italian names. Anyway, they arrived in 1927. Some of the family were already there, and that's how, of course, immigrants worked. They went and joined other members of the family who had done pretty well. So, I mean, they weren't going into poverty. The Bergoglios were not a poor family. They were a lower middle class family. And they joined the brothers and sisters of the grandparents in 1927. But in 1929 along came the Wall Street crash, the World Depression which followed it, and the whole family were left penniless. And so they moved to Buenos Aires, as it says there, in 1932. And until he was made Pope, Jorge Bergoglio lived in Buenos Aires practically his whole life, with short visits elsewhere. Right at the beginning, you can see their connection with the church. One of the reasons they went to Argentina was that the grandparents were running away, not running away, but they were getting away from Mussolini, who was rising, and the fascism that Mussolini stands for. They were very much Catholic, members of Catholic Action, although it's very difficult to know what Catholic Action was in one country to another, but they were very much opposed to Mussolini, and that was the main reason that they moved. His granny was very, very active. His granny was the kind of person who often spoke at public meetings and rallies and so on. And basically what they believed in was the church and protecting the rights of the church. That was the kind of Catholics they were at that time. They also, right from the start, had made friends with a guy called Don Enrico, who was a Salesian priest, and he was a kind of family chaplain who baptized Jorge Bergoglio and most of the rest of the family, and had a big influence on them. He, in fact, arranged for them to get a loan of 2,000 pesos, whatever 2,000 pesos was at the time, which allowed them to set up a small business. And they set up another confiteria, coffee and selling coffee and cakes. And they managed gradually to establish themselves. In 1935, the eldest son, Mario, married Regina Sivori, and they were Jorge Bergoglio's parents, and he was born in 1936. That's his mum and dad. You've probably seen that picture before. There are a few other pictures of them coming up. That's them, obviously, on the left. Making his first communion. That's him as a little bit older. That's the whole family. The grandparents sitting in the middle. Mario, the father, squeezing in beside his mother. Regina sitting in the arm of the chair. Then you have, obviously, Jorge by this time was a student, so he's got Satana on. Alberto and Oscar are the two brothers. The girls are Marta, is the youngest one. Maria Elena is the other girl. And the other fella's her boyfriend, who happens to be there and is in the picture. You may remember that woman. Do you remember seeing her in the news when the Pope was elected?
She's the one that he proposed to when he was 12-year-old. And she came out. He sent her a letter, if you remember, with a drawing of the house that they were going to live in. And according to the press, her mother wasn't happy at all and went down to the school and gave her a doom for being involved with this boy. That's him again, just as a student. He became, after secondary school, before he joined the Jesuits and so on, he became a lab technician there. And that's, obviously, that's a picture of him with two of his friends. Early influences on Jorge. Rosa, his grandmother, was a huge influence. She was the one that really transmitted faith to him. She was the one that also taught him about his Italian origins, because the instinct of the immigrants was to become part of the local community. But she taught him about Italy. She opened him up to a very open kind of Catholicism for the time. She was a very tolerant and understanding. So she had a big influence on him. The Salesians had a big influence. The De La Salle brothers, priests. Sister Dolores, who taught him in primary school, was the one who gave him solid catechesis. Estela Quiroga was another teacher who we remained friendly with for the rest of her life. I just put in San Lorenzo. That's San Lorenzo, the football team that he supported all his life. San Lorenzo are the third team in Buenos Aires, so they're the party football of Buenos Aires. Can you see over here? Yeah. I just put in the tango and the milonga. There's no place. Those, of course, are Italian, Argentinian dances. He was heavily. He loved all that Argentinian culture and loved dancing. The Argentinian church, which he grew up in of the 1940s, because he was only born in 1936. Those are the words used to describe it: vigorous, nationalistic, and Peronista. Juan Perón. We have to understand about Perón. We have to understand something about Italian politics to make sense of Jorge Bergoglio's life. And so we're going to have to talk a little bit about that. At the end of the 19th century, Pope Leo XIII wrote the first great social encyclical, Rerum Novarum, and it was extremely important in Argentina because of the poverty that people were experiencing. The church in Argentina at that time was doing what the Pope's still doing. It was challenging the whole concept of the free market economy. The free market economy was doing in Argentina then what it always does. It was making the rich richer and the poor poorer. And Rerum Novarum really spoke into that in Argentina and had a big, big influence at the time. Church teaching became, for many, many people, an alternative to the two extremes of right and left. On the right, there were the liberal economic people who wanted to let the market forces run, and on the left, there were, as always in Latin America, right up to quite recently, there was a pretty strong left, sometimes violent left, which plays a huge part in Bergoglio's story. And the church was the only organised labour movement, and it wasn't led either by anarchists or communists. So the church was playing an extremely important role in the social life of Argentina as Jorge Bergoglio was growing up. And a lot of the things that are there you'll find appear in him, and you can still see them in him today. An important event in Buenos Aires in Argentina in 1934 was the Eucharistic Congress. He didn't know anything about it, obviously, because he wasn't born, but it was one of the things his grandmother kept telling him about. And it brought about a real Catholic spring in Argentina. Lots of new dioceses sprung up, as it said. The seminaries filled up. Numbers at Mass started to go through the roof. Thousands joined Catholic action. Anti-liberal economics became the thing of the church. The alternative, as I've already said, there was an alternative to neoliberalism or liberalism at the time, which was not communism, which was Catholic social teaching. And
the people were hankering for an old Argentina. They started to romanticise a bit about the gauchos of the 19th century, the cowboys, the Great Plains and so on. They were dead against, they did not want foreign ways, and this runs through the whole of Jorge Bergoglio's life as well. They didn't want specifically to be like France and Britain. Nowadays it would be the United States, but France, Britain in particular, was the major power at the time, and was a huge influence on Argentina. And people did not want that. They wanted something specifically Argentinian. They wanted something that was new and different, something that belonged to them, that wasn't coming from abroad. And that's a huge thing in Bergoglio as well. And out of all this came, can you guess who comes out of this? Juan Domingo Perón. That's him. There's thousands of pictures of him, but that's the one I chose. Who do you think the next picture is? I've never seen the show actually, or seen the picture, but I'd like to see it now, just to see how kind of accurate it is. But, I mean, I often wonder what actual influence she had in Bergoglio, because Perón came to power in 1946 and was in power until for about nearly 10 years at that point. Now, Bergoglio would be 9 or 10-year-old when they came to power. She was such a powerful person through his teenage years. I mean, he must have been in love with her, because most of Argentina was, you know. She was a powerful sex symbol, she was a symbol of power, that people absolutely adored her, crowds adored her all the time. So she must have been part of his life very much. But Peronismo is a movement rather than a party, because the present government in Argentina is still Peronista. Although there are so many groups would claim Perón, the extreme left, the extreme right, all kinds of groups. That's why we would say that it's a movement rather than a party. And so it dominated Argentinian politics for decades. As I say, the government of Cristina Fernandez is Peronista, at least would claim to be. And as I said, it's become so many things to many people. But Peronismo began as a non-left alternative to the old order. And for that reason, as we'll see in a moment, it was based initially on Catholic social teaching and Verum Novarum and so on. Perón, very briefly, was from a modest family from Patagonia, that's away in the south of Argentina. Military training, military attaché to Chile. Journeyed in the late 30s to Italy, Spain and Germany, where he saw the rise of fascism. He joined a secret group of officers. I often wonder how secret these groups are, but he did that in 1941. Was part of the coup in 1943 and was the Minister of Labour, and introduced lots of labour reforms in favour of the working classes. He was supported by Evita, and she was a huge influence, and so he became the leader of the party and won the election in 1946. And now you see crowds of Peronistas. Now you have Evita herself speaking to the crowds of women by the looks of it. And as I said, the influence on the 10 to 19-year-old Jorge Bergoglio must have been and was quite powerful. It would have pleased him, coming from that Catholic background, that Perón was trying to implement social teaching of the church. Social justice was central to his programme. Nationalised the banks and railways. A lot of this sounds like the Labour Party, you know, in the 1940s. Although he spoke about humanising capital and dignifying labour. If ever there was a need in our country for that, it's now. Centralised industry and improved wages. Again, we've seen many other people do the same thing. Limited working hours, which the European Union has now done. Mandatory Sunday off. Built schools and hospitals. And as far as foreign policy was concerned, declared a third way in the Cold War disputes, tried to keep between the great powers, because that was, as I said already, was a very important thing in Argentina then. They didn't want foreign ways, they wanted their own way. And it's one of the things that influenced Bergoglio when we come to talk about liberation theology and all that kind of stuff. But all that's going on as he's growing up. The second term of Perón wasn't as successful. He basically won the election because Evita was dying at the time, and I presume that's what the film is about, is it? Is that the main? So it goes right back to the beginning, does it? Yeah. But Evita was a huge part of the appeal. The working classes, as I said, adored her. But the economy began to struggle, and when she died, that took away a lot of Perón's power. Support from the church began to lessen, because after the Second World War, the church became a bit wary about supporting fascist regimes in the light of what happened in the Second World War. Eventually, he was excommunicated by the church over prostitution and divorce. He was trying to legalise them, and then he became very anti-church, and actually kind of lost the plot of it. He held a rally. This was a terrible event. He organised a rally in the Plaza de Mayo, which I'll show you in a minute, in support of himself, and the military bombed the crowd and killed 400 people. I mean, it was a serious matter. So he was overthrown by a military coup in 1955. He was exiled to Spain, where Franco welcomed him. And he was there until he returned briefly to Argentina in the 1970s, which we'll see in a moment. But the result of all of this was that Argentina became the most unstable country in the Western Hemisphere. And again, all of this is the backdrop to Bergoglio's life. Once we start to look at what was going on for him and the problems that he had and others had with him. But this was I only put these in this afternoon just to show you the Plaza de Mayo. I don't think that top one is an actual photograph. It's to me like a kind of collage, but it's marking that event when they were bombed. To the right there, you'll see a demonstration, and you've seen that often because in the 1970s and 80s, regularly in our television screens, we saw these mothers in the Plaza de Mayo demanding that their disappeared children should be, and that is to some extent still going on. What it says on is there that they want the disappeared prisoners or detainees to reappear with life. That's all it says. And then at the bottom left, that's the Plaza de Mayo. And I thought I'd put that one on because it's actually quite interesting in the light of what's happening at the moment, because Argentina went through a whole series of economic crises. And in the late 90s, early 20th century, the economy basically collapsed. And what they're saying is, no to the payment of foreign debt. It says so in the light of what's happening to Greece, I thought that was quite an interesting one. Then the other one is just the Plaza de Mayo. And the cathedral is on the Plaza de Mayo, and the diocesan offices are just near it as well, because they're beside the cathedral. So that's a place that Bergoglio would have been utterly and totally familiar with, as he was with most of Buenos Aires. I thought I'd say a brief word about the death of Evita. You'll see lots of pictures of her dead body on the internet because it was a huge thing at the time. You see the crowds in the street there. I mean, as an event, it would have put the Princess Diana's funeral, you know, it couldn't compare with Evita's funeral. And I don't know if you know the story of her body, but I'll come to that in a minute. But she wasn't buried until 20 years after she died. Were any of you aware of that? For 2 years they were embalming the body. The body had to be embalmed, but the authorities in Argentina didn't want her tomb to become a shrine, so, a rallying point for opposition. So her body wandered around the world for years. It was in Germany for a while, it was in Milan for a while, but it finished up in Madrid, in Juan Perón's house. And according to the stories, he lived there with his third wife Isabella, and Evita was lying in her coffin on the dining room table.
That's what
Like, imagine having out there what it's like as a wife, you know. They say, I wouldn't necessarily believe all of this, but they say that Isabella used to lie beside her in the coffin to try and get some of her magic, because it's difficult for us to understand, but it was very primitive the way they responded to Evita's death, because they thought her body had power. You know, it was like a tribal thing. They thought their body had power, and people were trying to get hold of it and so on. There's stories of people dancing with the corpse and so on. So I mean, it was an incredible event, and she's still very much alive for lots of people in Argentina today. Very briefly, we're coming to Jorge's own life, but we need to get the background to it. Just very briefly, the story of his education and training. He went to school with the Salesians because his mother had a serious illness which she recovered from. But the Salesians took the children away to boarding school, and he qualified originally as a chemical technician. Then in 1955, he entered the diocesan seminary, and 2 years later decided he wanted to be a Jesuit. But in between times, there was an event which you'll have heard about as well, because this wasn't in news when he was elected. In 1957, he had a part of one of his lungs removed. There's a detail in there which I find absolutely fascinating. Apparently it was very, very serious. And the person who really saved his life at one point was a nurse, because she decided off her own bat, apparently, you couldn't do this in the National Health Service today, she decided off her own bat to treble the dose of his medication. She reckoned that would cure him, and she turned out to be right, you know. So he certainly couldn't do that kind of thing now. So he entered with the Jesuits in 58, the religious profession in 60, did his degree in philosophy. This is classic Jesuit preparation. Taught literature and philosophy in college in Buenos Aires. Then he studied theology this time in Buenos Aires. He was ordained a priest in 1969, which was the same year as me. And in fact, one of the things that's really struck me about this story is how much it touches into my own experience, because in 1953, he made his final vows as a Jesuit, and he became provincial at that point as well. And in 1973, it's one of those things, I could have been in South America, because I volunteered to go to South America at that time, and it was all set to go, until the bishop wrote to me one day and said something's happened, and would you postpone it? And I postponed it, and here I am, and I thank God from the bottom of my heart that didn't materialise. Because if I had gone to South America, it was either to Peru or Chile in 1973, and I'd fallen into the trap which Bergoglio abhorred so much, was that in his judgment, people were coming in their droves from Europe, thinking they had the solution to the South American problems. And a lot of the people who went, I don't think this is true of me, but I was teaching the seminary at the time in Blair's, and I wanted out of there. A lot of people went because they were trying to resolve their own personal problems and their own personal issues. And one of the things I've always questioned about that was that people who, you could go there to South America as a priest and you could stir up trouble. I mean, I knew one or two who did that. And But if the government intervened, if you were a foreign priest, you just get sent back home or into another country. It was the people who lived there who, had to live with the long-term consequences. And that was the kind of thing that Bergoglio was dead against. Anyway, in 1970 to 71, he went to Spain, to Alcalá de Henares, which is near Madrid, and he did his tertianship, which is the final stage of Jesuit formation. It involves the second experience of the spiritual exercises. In 1971 to 73, he was the Master of Novices in Buenos Aires, and in 1973 he made his final vows as a Jesuit, and at that time he became provincial, and this is where things start to get really mixed up for him. But before we look at that, I wanted to just read you this passage because it describes the moment in his life when he knew he wanted to be a priest. It was about 1963, so he was born in 36, so he was 17-year-old at the time. And he was going to meet his friends in Buenos Aires, including his girlfriend, and he describes what happened. I looked and it was dark. It was a morning in September, maybe 9 AM, and I saw a priest walking. I didn't know him. He wasn't one of the parish clergy, and he sat down in one of the confessionals. The last confessional as you're walking down the left side of the altar. I should have mentioned, obviously. He was, I'll just read it. I don't know quite what happened next. I felt like someone grabbed me from inside and took me to the confessional. Obviously, I told my things, I confessed, but I don't know what happened. Right there, I knew I had to be a priest. I was totally certain. Instead of going out with the others, I went back home because I was overwhelmed. Afterwards, I carried on at school and with everything, but knowing now where I was headed. And again, that reminds me of my own experience as well. There are little parallels which strike me all the time. Anyway, it was made, I think I've missed one. Yeah. Now we're going to look at Jorge Bergoglio's own life in this context. He was provincial, in other words, he was head of the Jesuit province in Argentina from 1973 to 79. They always do it in 6-year, 2-3-year terms. After that, he was rector in El Máximo, San Jose. It was a big Jesuit college and all kinds of, it was a massive place in Buenos Aires from 80 to 86. At the end of that time, he was removed from Argentina to Germany because things were so bad that they had to get him out of the country. But he returns after a short time and then is sent to Cordoba. And all of this, Germany, Cordoba, is because that after his years as provincial and head of the El Máximo, the whole Jesuit province in Argentina was plotting for and against him. They say in Argentina that they still have not recovered from that yet. Although I think when he was made Pope, there was a bit of healing. But it was absolutely split down the middle. They hated the sight of each other, the two sides. And it was all about him. So much so that to resolve it, the general in Rome had to bring in people from outside Argentina to try and sort it out. And what we have to look at now is try and answer the question, how did this happen? How did the Jesuit province in Argentina get into such a state because of the man who's now Pope Francis? And we have to look at the wider context. We have to remember 1973, it's the years after the Second Vatican Council, the Constitution of the Church in the modern world, the Church committing itself to the world, there's that whole movement. CELAM is the Conferencia, it's the Spanish, the Latin American Bishops' Conference. They were set up by Pope Paul VI in 1955. The great meeting was at Medellin in Colombia in 1968. That's the one that started the whole movement among the Jesuits and throughout Latin America, because that was the meeting of the South American bishops, where they totally committed themselves to the preferential option for the poor. They totally committed themselves to the poor, which is a huge turnabout for the church in Latin America, because all through its history, the church in Latin America is associated with the right, with the moneyed people, with reactionary forces and so on. But that was a big change. In 1979, there was another meeting which confirmed that, although mellowed it a wee bit. In fact, in the light of the... I'm trying to remember to come back to a quote from Puebla, because I think it reflects, it helps us understand something about what was happening in Argentina. 1992 in Santo Domingo, which was a pretty non-event, because Pope John Paul II was so determined to beat liberation theology that he came to open the thing and sat there for 3 days, just putting a damper on the whole thing, and then left one of his cardinals from Rome to carry on doing that. But then in 2007, the most recent meeting at Aparecida in Brazil, where Bergoglio played a huge part, a real synthesis of all that developed, which Bergoglio was central to, and which very much has laid out the future for the church in Latin America. So those meetings are going on. The Jesuits, in 1975, the 32nd General Congregation, was when they committed themselves to the preferential option for the poor. And in 1995, the 34th one, they confirmed that as well. So all of that's going on in the background. But the Jesuit province in Argentina, under Jorge Bergoglio, as I said earlier, was totally split because there were two diametrically opposing points of view at work. And they were about the meaning of the option for the poor, because the document in Medellin talked about the preferential option for the poor, but what that meant for many people was liberation theology, and the aspect of liberation theology that the Vatican, and John Paul II in particular, just would not accept. And that was its Marxist interpretation of the struggle in Latin America. The Vatican, and Bergoglio was entirely in agreement with this, said that Marxism could not bring about the kingdom of God, if you like. That a Marxist, class warfare-driven attempt to do something about poverty in Latin America was doomed to failure. That it had to be a faith enterprise. And so there was no question, never has been any question about Bergoglio's commitment to the poor, but it was how he understood the commitment to the poor that was the bigger issue. And as a result of his provincial years, Argentina in the 1970s was completely and utterly at odds with the rest of Latin America. Because in the rest of Latin America, the other interpretation, the liberation theology, the Marxism, the attempt, the willingness to justify violence, and the priests joining guerrilla groups and all the rest of it, that was basically what dominated the rest of Latin America. But in Argentina, because of Bergoglio, it was different, and that's where they absolutely tore each other apart. Those are the more radical groups, if you like. Their criticism of Bergoglio all the time was that he was interested in charity. He wasn't interested in justice. That he did incredible things, and he was totally committed to poor people. But they saw it as the handing out of charity. They said he hadn't grasped this whole notion of working for justice. He was fundamentally a spiritual director and a man totally committed to the spiritual exercises. And he believed that violence, whether it was from the right or the left, and one of the things that worried him was the fact that both sides could use the scriptures to try and justify their position. You know, that you had to break through that and begin to discern the will of God in the whole situation. When he was in charge of the seminary, I mean, he did things which, I think if I'd been there, it would have horrified me at the time, because he put all the students back into stands. He banned liberation theology books from the seminary. He sacked professors who were teaching liberation theology. So that didn't go down well, especially in the Jesuit province that he was part of. But what he did was, all these middle-class boys that were coming to join the Jesuits, because the vocations went up in his time, he introduced them to the poor. He sent them out into the barrios, he sent them out to feed people. They grew food within the seminary. They developed a garden, and they made that accessible to people. The stories of his own commitment to poor individuals was beyond question. So that wasn't the issue. It was a whole issue of charity versus justice. It was also about modern versus traditional, about, as I already mentioned, he was totally opposed to the whole notion of bringing European solutions to Latin America. All this liberation theology stuff, he believed was coming from South Americans who had been sent to study in Europe and had got all these European ideas from European philosophers and were coming back to Latin America to try and change the place. And his argument was, he always talked about God's faithful people. His notion was that you had to start with the people of Argentina. The answer lay in them, not in foreign ideas from abroad. And that's why people find this very strange too. He very much encouraged devotions, which other Jesuits in Latin America thought that the people should be rid of. You know, a lot of it was tied up with magic and statues and touching statues and all that. And he encouraged that because that was the faith of the people, he said. And you couldn't come in with all these highfalutin ideas and just do away with them. And also, as well as that, at the time, he talks about this later on in his life. He was too inexperienced, I think it talks about that. What was going on for Bergoglio? Looking back, he should never have been appointed provincial, he said, because he made his final profession in the same year as he was appointed provincial. What happened was that the previous provincial, who was called Fitzgerald, so there was some Irish folk went to Argentina as well. Under him, he very much encouraged the liberation theology and basic Christian communities and all that kind of stuff. But the whole thing was imploding. And so they took him out of office a year before they should have done. And so, of course, they don't elect him, they appoint him from Rome. And so Bergoglio was a consultant. So he and the other consultants were sent around the houses in Argentina to get a sense of who the other Jesuits thought should be provincial. And lo and behold, he was the one that was recommended, and he became provincial. And looking back, he says that when he was made Pope, he talked, we'll get a quote from him at the very end, about all the mistakes he made, you know, and how authoritarian he was. And he puts a lot of that down to his lack of experience. His spirituality, as I mentioned already, was about the discernment of spirits, which many of us have looked at, and that's what we looked at last year. The 2005 conclave, Ivory suggests, see what happened at the 2005 conclave was that, as you know, Cardinal Ratzinger emerged as Pope Benedict, but within the conclave there was a lot of support for Bergoglio, and he pleaded with them to move their votes to Cardinal Ratzinger. And they reckon the reason was, one, nobody had asked him whether he was willing to be Pope. You know, people were putting forward his name without asking him. But praying and discerning what was going on, he was horrified by the division that was developing in the conclave. And he didn't want to be part of that, and so he basically withdrew from it, and Cardinal Ratzinger became Pope. at the next conclave, it wasn't a surprise to him that he was made Pope, because they checked out with him. Was he willing to take the job, you know? And basically he said that he thought if somebody was asked to do it, they should do it. And he was voted in. And I think a lot of people would reckon that he actually kind of wanted, he felt he had something to offer. Also, the influence of Perón was on him at this time. Remember how Perón was all about a middle way between the East and West, a middle way between the anarchists and the communists on one side and the military on the other side. And he was dead against isms of any kind. One of his great principles was that reality is superior to the idea. You have to deal with reality and not impose some kind of ism on it. That was very much part of his insight. And of course the other great big thing that was going on all over Latin America at the time was fear of communism. The forces of the right basically were now in the 70s and 80s. They came of the CIA, which was funding right-wing groups all over Latin America. I mean, why we're surprised now to discover that the CIA were torturing people amazes me, because they've been torturing people for decades, you know, and were doing it all over Latin America in the 70s and 80s. But there was a terrible fear of communism. And of course, tied up with all that was Cuba, because Cuba was financing an awful lot of these wars in the 60s and 70s, these guerrilla movements all over Latin America. And Che Guevara, of course, was the great figure. Everybody was going about with Che Guevara shirts on. And I mean, that was part of my story as well, because when I was teaching in Blair's, I taught a whole year of a course on Che Guevara, because I was into Che Guevara at the time, you know. And that's why I'm so glad that I didn't go to Latin America at that time, because I'd have been a menace. just as so many other people who went from Europe into Latin America were menaces. And Bergoglio could see that. And also the fact that he was responsible, he was responsible to keep his fellow Jesuits safe during the Dirty War. The Dirty War in Argentina goes on from 1974 to 1983. In 1973, Perón came back briefly, died in 1974. Isabella, who was a disaster, but she was his wife, so she became president very briefly. And then in 1974 there was a military coup under General Varela and two other from the Navy and from the Air Force. And they began what they called a process of national reorganization. Sounds like rearranging industry, but what it actually meant was killing everybody who was opposed to what they were doing. It was a horrific period of time. It was highly organized and highly systematic. It was supported by the rich. It was supported by some bishops. And Opus Dei were heavily involved with the people who were doing this. I mean, that's what the mothers are complaining about. You know, they disappeared. 30,000, I think it does. 11,000 murdered, 30,000 desaparecidos, 5,000 military deaths. But it was a dirty war. They didn't have a straightforward war. They had learned from the Allende Pinochet thing in Chile, and so it was all very secretive. Young people just disappeared, were never seen again. They were taken into centres around Argentina and are very tortured and so on. And the most common way of killing them was to put them in helicopters and airplanes, fly out over the Atlantic and just fling them into the Atlantic. I mean, it was a horrific time, and it was called a process of national reorganization. On the other side, of course, there were the Montoneros. The Montoneros were the guerrilla movement. Both of these, they claimed to be successors of Perón, and both of them could find biblical justification for what they were doing. The whole notion of liberation theology was about forming small basic communities, exposing people to the scriptures and helping them to begin to free themselves. Now, that didn't always flow over into killing folk, but often, sometimes it did. And that certainly happened during the Dirty War. So the Montaneros were, sorry, we'll come to them. Those, top left is General Varela and his two pals. The right is some of the women protesting about their children who disappeared. The bottom left is General Varela, receiving communion, because he was a very sincere Catholic who was probably a member of Opus Dei, because they firmly believed what they were doing was protecting Argentina from communists. That's what they thought they were doing. And this is Escuela de Mecánica de la Armada. It was the most famous, the most notorious of all the centres where people were taken and tortured. But the Montaneros, they were the other side. And you see there on the top left the pictures of Evita and Juan Perón. This is the 70s, you know. We're experiencing this at the time as well in Northern Ireland. And the one top right shows something we were very familiar with, which was a bus that was on fire. The Montaneros had a lot of popular support, as you can see in the bottom left-hand side. And then, of course, I put that in that little book, Catholicismo y Montaneros, Catholicism and the Montaneros. Again, the classic biblical story that they used to justify what they're doing was the parable of the wheat and the darnel. You know, they were told that what they were doing was clearing out the darnel. They were purifying Argentinian society. And of course, that's exactly what Franco, for example, that was how he justified what was going on during the Spanish Civil War, getting rid of all these lefties, all these dangerous people. And the one on the bottom was in one particular occasion when these children were killed by a bomb. It says, murdered by terrorism, and at the very bottom it says, look them in the eyes and explain to them that their murderers were idealistic young men. You know. So it's all the same stuff that was going on in Ireland and elsewhere. A terrible, terrible time. And in the middle of that, Bergoglio is trying to act as provincial. And there are three main charges against him, which people answer in different ways. That he did not speak out. That has to be seen in a wider context because the Argentinian bishops didn't speak out. Partly because there were a small group of them who totally supported the military and what they were doing, protecting Argentina from communists and dangerous lefties. There was a small group that were very much against that, and the vast majority in the middle didn't want to speak up. Bergoglio was the provincial of the Jesuits. Should he have spoken up? I don't know what you think, but it's very easy to sit here in West Kilbride and say that he should have done, you know, but it's very, very difficult. There was one bishop called Angelelli who spoke up. Within 3 weeks, he was dead. And 3 other bishops in the course of the Dirty War who spoke up were killed. Angelelli, it was a bit like the film Romero, because what happened was he was found in a car crash, but it transpired, it was obvious that he had been beaten to death, he'd been clubbed to death, and then and that was because he spoke up. So there's a whole question there. I mean, you get the same question asked about Pius XII with the Jews, and so on. If you were in this situation, I don't know what I would do. People would argue they would make things worse if they spoke up. Bergoglio didn't want to intimidate, he didn't want to cause trouble for his fellow Jesuits. He managed to get the Jesuits through that whole period without anybody being killed, whereas there were 150 other priests killed in Argentina during the Dirty War. But there is a question there to be answered. And as soon as he was elected Pope, all these questions were asked. If you go onto the internet, you'll be appalled by, maybe not appalled, but there are websites, there are things there that just take it for granted that Pope Francis is a war criminal. They don't even question it. There's huge support for him as well. I mean, he did a lot to try and, that seminary where he was in charge, I mean, that was one of those places, droves of people were taken there for safety and smuggled out of the country and so on. So there's record after record after record of it. But there is this question about collaborating. Were they collaborating or were they not? The particular case is the betrayal of these two Jesuits, Orlando Yorio and Franz Janix. You're probably aware of this. These were two Jesuits who worked in basic Christian communities in Buenos Aires. And as things were getting worse, Bergoglio, who was the provincial, wanted them to come away from these basic Christian communities for their own safety. And they wouldn't come. So he ordered them to do it. And for the Jesuits, obedience is a huge, huge thing. And they refused. So he informed the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires about this situation, and within 3 days they were arrested and taken to one of these centres where they were tortured. Now, the indications are that this happened for an entirely different reason, but a lot of people have blamed him for that he abandoned them, because the choice he gave them was, if you don't obey me, you'll have to leave the Jesuits, because, I mean, obedience is everything to the Jesuits. They say that he threw them out, the Jesuits, and left them exposed. And his argument is that they chose to do that. But again, huge controversy around it. Orlando Yorio, he died in the early 20th century, still blaming Bergoglio for this. The other one was reconciled to him, stayed in the Jesuits, and now accepts, now has seen enough evidence for him to believe that actually he didn't tip off the government about it. But it's a whole area where there are questions to be answered. And the last one is this scandal of lost babies. This is like Franco's Spain. A lot of these young people that were being disappeared, some of them would be pregnant. And so what the government did was they took them until the children were born. Then they handed the children over to, you know the story, to good right-wing Catholic families, and then murdered the mothers. And the accusation against Bergoglio was that he colluded in this. Because, of course, priests and nuns, like in Spain and elsewhere, they were up to their eyes in Ireland and places like that. And the reason they accuse him of this is because of this girl called Elena de la Cuadra. Elena de la Cuadra was a catechist who was arrested, and her father came to Bergoglio. Remember, he's still the Jesuit provincial, he's not bishop yet, and asked if he could help. And he gave the family letters to take to the bishop in the part of Argentina where all this was happening, and the family still have those letters. But in 2010 there was an inquiry, a court case, and Bergoglio, who was the Archbishop at this time, was asked to go as a witness. And he was asked about these babies. And he said that he had only learned about this situation with babies 10 years previously, in other words, around the year 2000. And the prosecutor, well, he wasn't a prosecutor because he was a witness, rather he wasn't accused of anything in the court. And he said, really? And they said, what about Elena de la Cuadra? And Bergoglio answered, well, maybe 25 years ago. Now there's a question to be answered there. His case is that the letters never ever mentioned that she was pregnant, and that's true. The letters are available. It doesn't say anything in them about having pregnant. So Bergoglio's argument in his case is that the father never mentioned that to him. That he was just asking them to help release her. But again, there are questions, and if you're so inclined to, and you want to find fault, and you want to find reasons to attack him, there's another one, okay? So those are the three main accusations against him. At the end of all this, things were so bad among the Jesuits, with each other's throats, that he was sent to Germany to do his PhD, but he couldn't settle to that, and a few months later he returned to Argentina. He was actually elected at that point into another post because the general in Rome who had just changed, was a fellow called Kolbenbach, he was trying to impose in Argentina a style of training now which was the opposite of everything that Bergoglio had stood for. It was a Spanish style training, and there were so many Jesuits in Argentina that worshipped the ground Bergoglio walked on that he was elected into the position of the procurator. And that didn't help matters at all. And so in 1990, to try and get some peace, some settlement to the whole thing, he was sent to Cordoba, not in Spain, but in Argentina, which is 400 miles from Buenos Aires. And they spent 2 years there. It was a wilderness time for him. It was an opportunity for prayer and reflection. And big question between these two fellas here, who've been having quite silly letters, I think, at the tablet over the last few weeks, arguing, this fellow's arguing that in Cordoba he had a conversion experience, and this fellow's saying that this fellow's in Egypt for thinking he had a conversion experience in Cordoba. And it actually seems to me that, I mean, actually there's not much between them, but I want to read last week's letter, which is from Vallely, and what he says is this. He replies to Ivory, but then he says at the end, anyway, leaving aside the dispute between them, what is inescapable is that before Cordoba, the leadership style of Jorge Mario Bergoglio was that of a rigid, severe, dutiful disciplinarian, authoritarian, who rarely smiled, was happy to be driven around by a priest chauffeur, and who cared for the poor as people who needed charity. Afterwards, he became gentler, more forgiving, more listening, more consultative, and more anxious to empower the poor, acknowledging that they needed not merely charity, but justice. He also became a man, in his first interview as Pope, admitted making hundreds of errors in his early years as a leader, and who speaks about forgiveness and mercy in a riveting way that clearly springs from some dramatic experience of both. And he got rid of his episcopal mansion and chauffeur and took the bus. Clearly something major had happened. And it seems to me that whether, I don't think he had a kind of road to Damascus experience, but he changed, as we all do when we've time to reflect and look back on our experience and begin to see our own weaknesses more clearly than we've seen them before. And that came to an end in 1992 when he was appointed the auxiliary Archbishop of Buenos Aires. The Archbishop had wanted him to be made a bishop before, but there was so much opposition to him that he couldn't get it through the system in Rome, but eventually he did. And he was made auxiliary bishop. 1997 he became coadjutor bishop, which just means that he had the right to succession. In 1998, when his predecessor died, he became Archbishop of Buenos Aires, became a cardinal in 2001, his first conclave in 2005 when Benedict was elected, and in 2013 he was elected Pope. And as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, as that letter indicates, we come across not an entirely different man, but a man who has moved on, because he always was committed, very, very committed to the poor in his own way. But the first thing he does, as that letter indicates, is he moves out of he does what he did when he became Pope. You'll see the parallel. He moved out of the Archbishop's Palace, which was a posh place in the outskirts of Buenos Aires. He turned that big building into a home for priests and moved into an office in the middle of Buenos Aires. He wouldn't use the Archbishop's office, which was big and posh. He insisted in using a wee office. So you're just seeing a prelude to what happens when he becomes Pope. He addressed corruption in the diocese, the same as he did in Rome. He got in the auditors and discovered about the corruption that was going on. As I said to some of you today, he learned early on about that, because quite early on in his time as Cardinal Archbishop, or as Archbishop, he was offered a grant by a government minister. I think it was 4 million pesos or something. And when it actually happened, what he was expected to do was to take the sign for 4 million and get 2 million, you know. And so the rest, as happens all over the world, things. And of course, he refused to then to do with that, because if he had done it once, that was him caught. And that's what's happened to the church all over the world. It gets pulled into that kind of corruption. And once you're in it, you're complicit in it, and you can't get out. And it happens to all kinds of organisations. I mean, the stories of his help for individual people are a legend. Perhaps the most dramatic one is the Bishop Podesta, who you'll have read about. He was a bishop in Argentina who left and married an extreme feminist, and the two of them used to celebrate Mass together. She would come celebrate with him. So he was a wee bit odd. So he was an outcast as far as the justice. But when his life was coming to an end, Bergoglio, who remember this time was a cardinal, went to visit him. I find that very moving. And not only that, when he died, he continued to look after the woman, and has been a friend to her ever since. He sent more and more priests into the slums, which he had been dead against before. The way he looked after his priests was amazing. Apparently, what he used to do was, if one of them was ill, he'd go and cover for him, he'd go and do his washing, clean his flat, cook for him, because his mother had taught him to cook. Well, I think most Italian mothers probably do that. He just was not a different person, but a transformed person as well. He became the bishop of the slums. He challenged the government. Of course, by this time it's easier for him to challenge the government because he's a cardinal archbishop. So I mean, you're in a safer position then than he was before. But he challenged them over so many issues of social justice, corruption, drugs and gambling, especially during the economic collapse at the end of the 90s. Apparently Buenos Aires was just awash with people trafficking and all kinds of stuff. He challenged it, the abuse of women, abortion and same-sex marriage. He had a real row with the government about that. But all this time is still estranged from the Jesuits. And I thought I'd give you those pictures of Buenos Aires, because the top left and the bottom right, you have his cathedral. It's more like a Roman temple, isn't it? And in the other two, you have a different picture. You have somebody saying Mass in one of the barrios here, and you have Bergoglio himself with some people, obviously, in one of the barrios. So you've got two sides of Bergoglio in Buenos Aires there. Possible reasons for this change: obviously he's growing in experience, he's had time to reflect, he's understanding his own personality better. Latin America's changing anyway. The fall of the Berlin Wall kind of brought the Cold War to an end. The fear of communism wasn't as great. He travelled abroad more. He was involved with the conference of bishops from other parts of Latin America, and of course he would be reading. So there's a whole opening up of him goes on at this time. Which brings him to the conclave of 2013, which I've already referred to, when he was elected Pope. One of the things that delights me was that very quickly after that he was reconciled with the Jesuits, because he hadn't visited the Jesuit headquarters in Rome for 20 years. Normally, when Jesuits go to Rome, they would stay there. But when he went there as a cardinal, as a bishop, he never had any contact with them. But one of the first things he did was contact the Father General, Father Nicolas, whom you see in the top left-hand corner. But I think it's a very interesting picture, because you see, as a Jesuit, the Pope has a vow. Well, Bergoglio, let's call him Jorge Bergoglio, has a vow of obedience to the General. But as a Jesuit, the General has a vow of obedience to the General. So it's like two cowboys with one. But you can see as I'm having a meal with them, and on the Feast of St. Ignatius last year, in 2013, he went to the Gesù in Rome, which is the Jesuit church, and he celebrated Mass with these 200 Jesuits. So there was a healing of past trouble there. When he was made Pope, the Father General wrote to all after he had visited They did it within a matter of days. They went to visit the Jesuit headquarters in Rome. And the Father General wrote a letter to Jesuits throughout the world in which he said, very interesting, "This is the time to appropriate the words of mercy and goodness that Pope Francis repeats so convincingly, and not to allow ourselves to be swept away by distractions from the past, which may paralyze our hearts and lead us to interpret reality with values that are not inspired by the gospel." And there's an obvious reference there to the split between him and the Jesuits over the years. And then we have a little quote from the Pope himself. "My authoritarian and quick manner of making decisions led me to have serious problems and to be accused of being ultra-conservative. But I have never been a right-winger." You can make your own judgment about that. But there's so much in there about 20 years of his life, 25 years of his life. And now I'm suggesting to you that he needs everyone's support. On the top left there you have him in a happy situation with children. On the bottom left you may have read about the man he met with the most horrific deformed face, and the Pope took him and caressed him and so on. And that's him, that's his compassion. On the top right hand side I think you see he's a man perhaps, maybe he was a bit tired that day, but those two speak to me of a man who needs a lot of support. Down in the bottom picture there he's sitting there himself, you know, and the responsibilities that he has taken on. And so we need to listen to him even when his heart's getting blown off. We need to support him and we need to listen to him. And that's what the rest of the course will be about, listening to his teaching. And next meeting, the 25th of February, we'll look at the first document he produced, which is the Joy of the Gospel. So I hope that helps you to understand something about him. So, imagine there's infinitely more. Man, as I was reading this in Spain and then taking notes, the problem was, how do you decide what to say? Because there's so much. There's so many stories, for example, about the way his dealings with individuals. We're hearing them now, you know, he phoned the guy about his paper and phones up people. He's always done that, you know. He had no confidence in isms, and he said something which actually I think I've said about myself. People are saved one at a time, and he was much more interested in individual people than he was in movements or isms. And you can see that in him all the time. That's the kind of person he is. But some of you might have comments. We'll get 9. We say we aim at finishing at 9. So if there's anything you want to say or ask about or comment on, we've got a few minutes to do that.
He's a breath of fresh air in the church, having the courage to be standing up to the curia and the bank and at least being seen to be trying to improve things and not just let it run.
Yes. The phrase that he's used all his life is, and he borrowed it from one of the fathers of the church, I think, is he sees the greatest evil that afflicts the church as a spirit of worldliness. It's the seeking of position, status, dressing up. I mean, he has no time for that kind of stuff. When he was made Archbishop of Buenos Aires, I mean, the first thing people do, our bishop did it last week. They go off to Rome and they buy all the gear and all that kind of stuff. And our new bishop has just done that.
Do they have to buy it?
No, but to buy it. Oh, there's a well-known tailors in Rome. When he was made Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he just got a couple of women to take the old guy's stuff and make it fit her. That's all he did. And the other guy was a completely different shape for him, apparently. There's a woman across the road there who could have done it. She's absolutely amazing. Anything else? What do you think of the charges against him? Are they founded? What do you think about the speaking up?
I think, as you said, it's very difficult. If you're not sitting here, you think, you should have said that's wrong. But it's like watching things that happened during the Second World War. Would you have the courage to stand up?
That's right.
It's hard to.
We didn't need any difference.
If you go into a housing estate anywhere in Britain today, it's a very courageous person that would report drug dealers to the police. You know, it's very, very. And interestingly, he was asked recently if, and I connected these two things. I don't know if they are connected. But he was asked, was he not afraid of somebody killing him? And he said he didn't think about that. The only thing he prayed was that it wouldn't be sore because because he's not good with pain, you know. So I just wondered if that shed a little bit of light on the other business.
The change in him is quite miraculous, isn't it? That's what I think is important.
See, these two would, that's exactly what they argue about, whether he changed or whether he was just the same person.
I see it as change.
Yeah, I think it was maybe development or growth would be miraculous.
What strikes me is his great strength, right from the very beginning, to be the man that he was carved out to be.
Yeah, possibly the strength was his weakness at that point. You know, he was, as he says himself, he was very quick to make the sound. But he also, as I said in the course of the talk, the main thing he puts it down to, apart from his other weaknesses, is that he should never have been appointed to that post at such a young age. I mean, imagine he makes his final vows in the same year as he's appointed provincial. At a time when the Dirty War is already underway. I mean, someone with a lot more experience than him would have struggled with that kind of thing.
You made the comparison to Northern Ireland. I remember there were many times when things were bad in Northern Ireland. A lot of us were saying, why is the church not standing up here and speaking out more and more?
Yes.
It is,
Yes.
it's
I think it is that the church, even in Argentina, if they had spoken out, would it have mattered? You know, what?
Would it have helped? It would have not
It would
helped.
have done more harm than good.
That's Pius XII's argument about speaking out against Hitler, but who knows? Not Pius XII so much as defenders of him.
We also have to remember he's a human being just like the rest of us.
That's right.
Frightened and all the rest of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
To what extent could you argue, I mean, as an outsider listening to the story, and I've read one of these books, Joe, he strikes me as a chastened man who is even a slightly guilty man. Is that unfair?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, that phrase, when I said it, I made lots of errors. There's a much longer sentence where he talks about not just errors, but sins, he says. You know, he's very much aware of the mistakes that he made, the things that he's done wrong. Whether he feels guilty about it, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. I've never met the man. He's certainly extremely compassionate, you know, and hopefully that would be coming.
If you've been through that, and I entirely accept the argument that you're speaking out in that situation, you could be dead, as happened.
Yes.
But if you've been through that, even though you knew you might be dead,
Yes.
you're still going to think,
Yes.
what should I, could I have done more? You know, we'd all do
I
that.
think he had a very difficult time with those two Jesuits.
Yeah.
You know, could he have done something different? What should he have done? I think the thing he probably felt most guilty about was the way, by informing the Archbishop, the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, that could easily have found its way to the government, because within days they were arrested. They had lost the protection that a member of the province gave them. But they weren't actually killed. They were eventually released. And he did lots of things to try and liberate them. He did everything he could. He may well have felt guilty about it.
We're saying that if it was the Jesuit provincial now, after his experiences, he would speak out now. Is that what we're collectively saying then? If it changed him so much?
Well, he did speak out about all kinds of things once he became bishop. But as I said moments ago, it was easier to to do it then. You know,
Yes.
once you're in the public. In fact, one of the things he did at one point, there was when he was bishop in Buenos Aires, there was a priest working in the slums who had got word that he was in danger. And he went to Bergoglio to see what, and Bergoglio decided the best protection was publicity. And so, at Mass a couple of days later, in the cathedral, he made public that this priest had been threatened and so on. And so the people in the barrio gathered round him and supported him. So it's much more difficult for the authorities to kill somebody after that. So he used publicity as a form of defence.
He certainly lived a life.
He has, yeah. Anything else?
It's what happens next that matters. This is interesting and contextual, but it's what he does now.
That's right, and that's what we'll look at, and that's why on the programme, the last meeting, we don't know what it's going to be yet. You know, the last meeting is about what's happening between now and then. Well, I mean, who knows? Who knows what will happen? I think the whole business of reforming the Curia will go on. Some people have criticised him for being slow, but the reason he's given himself for being slow is that he doesn't want to make the mistakes he made in the past and move in there with quick decisions. He wants to take time and consult people and get people behind him.
Doesn't want to get seriously ill too quickly.
No. Anything else? Is there anything about what we've said, does it surprise you? I mean, are you disappointed in him in any way, or shocked, or surprised?
The interesting thing to me is the fit of the interest in the centre, but the central way, if you like, in South America, and how that maps over from the politics occurring through to the position that the church adopts to an extent as well. And it put the Romero thing in context, which is always something that I wondered about.
See, some people hold up Romero as an example of somebody who did speak out.
Indeed.
And the guy in Argentina who spoke out was dead within 3 weeks. And there were the other bishops and 150 priests and countless catechists and people in the, you know, and just anybody at all. I mean, anybody at all who was considered a leftist. And basically being left for that government meant that you didn't agree with them. Anybody who didn't agree with you was leftist. That General Varela finished up dead and dying in prison because in the 80s, early 80s, when the Dirty War came to an end, it was a wee bit like, you see the same to some extent in Ireland. It certainly happened in Spain. There was a law which said, you know, more or less drew a line and said no prosecutions. But a later government changed that, and a lot of these fellows got to jail. There's another interesting connection with ourselves, which I meant to mention, because the Dirty War came to an end in the early 80s, and one of the last throes of it, one of the last throes of it was, it was the Falklands War. Because the Falklands War, by that time it was General Galtieri that was leading, but the Falklands War was an attempt to unify the country because of the division, you know, take their attention away from what we can in Argentina. And the Pope was a great supporter of what the Archbishop of Buenos Aires believed in what the Argentinians were doing. You know, this was clearly Argentinian territory, and the Britain had usurped it and so on. I mean, it was an Argentinian, they believed all of that stuff and spoke openly about it. But the Falklands War was the final act of the Dirty War. After that, democracy started to come to Argentina again. I mean, in Spain, Franco always did that. If there was trouble, he would stir up something about Gibraltar, you know, and then everything. And we do the same thing. I saw there was a lot of stuff months ago about the start of the First World War. You know how they say we drifted into the First World War. One of the motivations for going into the First World War, some historians say, was exactly the same. Because there was a lot of social unrest and going on in Britain, unions and all that kind of stuff. And the government thought, well, the war will take their minds off all that. I mean, so there's nothing new about it. That has always happened. I mean, even it's not about a war, but I mean, I don't want to get into Scottish politics, but I mean, the classic thing in Scotland, if the government gets, if either the colour gets into a wee bit of trouble, is to turn their attention against the English. You know, it's the us, it's the English, you know, turn your attention to somewhere else, and there's nothing new about it.
During the Dirty War, Joe, why were the Jesuits protected?
Because they had, because they would have some status, you know, the Jesuits were important, and as long as they weren't stirring up too much trouble, they would be okay, and that's why Bergoglio wanted to bring them back in out the slums and so on, for their own protection, and that would be the main reason. But look, you see, there were Jesuits. One of the things, apparently the north of Buenos Aires is the posh part of Buenos Aires, and there was an institute up there full of Jesuits, classic Jesuits, you know, doing research and all that kind of stuff, and they had no time for Bergoglio. But his followers called them whiskey drinking armchair socialists, you know, because they were into isms, you know, they were doing research and writing books about it. And Bergoglio's fellows were out in the slums, not working for justice, but feeding folk and handing out help and all that kind of stuff. So you can begin to understand what the problem was. And it's worth remembering that Argentina was different from the rest of Latin America. And of course, one of the things he would discover when he became a bishop and started mixing with the other South American bishops, he would start to get a different perspective on it. And that was one of the things that I mentioned. Okay. Right. So we'll see you in a month's time.